Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitre College, Delhi University, and this lecture is the second part of the lecture Somerset Maugham, the Essayist. As discussed in the previous lecture as well, we mentioned that how this particular lecture is kind of a concluding lecture for the series on the English essay. And we've had various discussions on this genre, on this style of writing across the past many weeks, where we developed an understanding of this style of writing right from the 18th century up until the 20th century, and how different writers then contributed to this form and made it their own as well, experimented with it also at on a lot of fronts. Now, in discussion, particularly in this lecture, has been the author Somerset Maugham, who primarily is known as a fiction writer, but also has contributed immensely to the essay or the non-fiction form as well. So now in this lecture, we're going to discuss an essay by Somerset Maugham that is titled "The Decline and Fall of the Detective Story." And this essay actually appears in a 6-essay volume called The Vagrant Mood in 1952. Now, you see, if you remember from the last lecture, we had discussed that how, literary criticism, when we were discussing the defining features of this author's style of writing, we said that along with being autobiographical, having a simple style of writing, showcasing a very a sharp understanding of human nature. Along with that, we said that how his non-fiction also works as they contribute to literary criticism. So which means that he thinks about, or his essays then carry commentaries on the authors of the times and the different styles of writing. So that's why this essay which we are discussing today, that is The Decline and Fall of the Detective Story, falls in line with that particular trend of his. Okay, now here in this particular write-up, he thinks about the form of detective story. He gives his opinions on what this form should be like, what makes this form successful, and also what are some of the limitations that are there, or that he observes, particularly in the way different authors have dealt with it around his time, right? So let us begin by looking at a few excerpts and understanding what is Somerset Maugham doing in this particular essay. So he begins the essay by saying, with a very autobiographical reference, and once again, this also, brings to the fore yet another feature of his essay, which we discussed in the last lecture as well. That is the presence of the autobiographical details, right? So that's how he begins this essay. He says, "At the outbreak of the last war, I found myself imprisoned at Bandol, a seaside resort on the Riviera. Imprisoned, I should add, not by police but by circumstances." Now, here what we notice is that he is beginning with a reference from the time when he was sailing, and he had to remain imprisoned. And but very clearly, he says that I was not in prison, or I was not imprisoned by the police, but by circumstances. Now, what are these circumstances? He goes on to add, "I was in fact in a sailing boat. She was in peacetime berthed at Villefranche, but but the naval authorities ordered us to leave, so we set sail for Marseille. We were caught in a storm and took refuge at Bandol, where there was something of a harbour. The movements of private individuals were restricted, and one could not even go as far as Toulon. I was obliged to stay put, unquote. Now you see, as a reader, when we come across this essay, well, the title braces us for a discussion of the detective stories. But how does this essay begin? With this incredibly autobiographical account of him being imprisoned on a boat during a war, imprisoned not by police, but as he says, by circumstances, which means that they could not have gone out. They had to remain inside on the harbour. They couldn't have left the boat. So and this is the time of the war. So two things are established right at the outset, that how the times were not normal, but at the same time it tells us that that this is the time when he actually started writing. So what was the reason for giving this particular reference? In order to bring home the point that what actually made him think about detective stories and write about them in this particular essay of his. So he in fact takes the reader to the actual moment when he sat down to write the essay, right? So that's where the autobiographical element is introduced right at the outset. Okay. Now moving on to the next important thing that he says in the essay, and I quote, he says, "I have read hundreds of detective stories, good and bad, and they have to be very bad indeed for me to cast them aside unfinished. But I do not pretend to be more than a dilettante. It is with the stories of crime that I wish to concern myself, and especially with that of murder. Theft and fraud are crimes too, and they may give rise to some pretty work in detection, but they arouse in me an interest which is no more than languid," unquote. So now here he is once again establishing the fact that how he has read hundreds, as he says, of detective stories, both good and bad. Okay, and then he says that he has hardly ever cast aside or put aside a detective story without actually finishing it. So which means what? That he has an immense experience, exposure to this style of writing. Okay, but then he goes on to say, with a lot of humility, having established this, he says that I do not pretend to be more than a dilettante. Means that his knowledge yet is not that of an expert, and so that is nothing but his humility, right? And then he establishes that while detective stories or detective fiction is a broad genre that comprises various scenarios, he is particularly interested in stories of crime, right? And especially with the stories of murder, not of theft and fraud. Okay. Now, what does this tell us? That even while writing an essay, even while writing a piece of non-fiction about a style of writing or a genre, he connects it to himself, right? He is not writing from, let's say, any privileged position, but he is establishing himself as someone who is interested in this genre or in this style of writing, who has read detective fiction and who has a preference for stories of crime and not the stories of theft and fraud, and that is where his observations are coming from. Okay, so not making it appear as a text which is sacrosanct, with observations that are incredibly significant or serious. No, he humanizes this topic as well by connecting it to his own life, his own experience, and presenting it in a very modest fashion, right? So that is what we were discussing about the simple style, the autobiographical style of Somerset Maugham. Okay, now going on. Now, having established that what exactly or why exactly does this style of writing interests him, then he goes on to comment a bit on the theory of what he calls the detective story of deduction. Okay, so let's see what he says about that in the essay. He says, and I quote, "The theory of the detective story of deduction is simple. Someone is murdered, there is an investigation, suspicion falls on a number of persons, the culprit is discovered and pays the penalty of his crime. This is the classic formula, and it contains in itself all the elements of a good story, for it has a beginning, a middle, and an end." Now you see, so he begins by giving us a broad structure of the form of a detective story, right? That broadly, that what are some of the stages that such a narrative goes through. And by the way, if some of you have read Edgar Allan Poe, you will notice that he borrows this structure actually from Poe, and in fact he also acknowledges him in the essay as well, right? So it begins with somebody's murder, then following it is an investigation, and then there's suspicion on a few people, and thereafter the culprit is discovered, and then he has to pay the price of the penalty of his crime. So we notice that these are broadly how the story or a detective narrative moves. Now from there, having established that formal structure, he goes on to talk about another very important aspect, that is of the idea of sympathy in detective fiction. Now what does he say? Let's look at that. He says, and I quote, "There is one curious thing about sympathy which I do not think everyone is aware of. The reader's sympathy goes to those characters who are first presented to him, and not only in crime stories but in other stories as well. He will be left with the feeling that he has been imposed upon if the persons for whom his interest has been aroused during the first 10 pages do not turn out to be those with whom he is afterwards to concern himself." Okay, so we'll just pause at that and then look at the other part of this quote. But what is he talking about here? He is talking about the reader's sympathy. He says that the moment a reader starts reading a text, the initial characters that appear in the narrative, they become the object of the reader's sympathy. He sympathizes with them. Okay, sympathizes does not mean that in the sense of they are necessarily going through a hard time and he sympathizes from that front. No, which means that he somewhat is drawn to these characters. Okay, and is deeply invested in these characters. Now here Maugham says that it is these people or these characters for whom his interest has been aroused. Okay, and if they do not turn out to be the same people towards the end around him, around whom the narrative is woven, then he feels somewhat disconcerted. Okay, that is what Maugham means by the reader's sympathy. Now, moving on from here, adding to this, he says, and we continue with the quote, he says, I think it would be worth the while of the writers of detective stories to remember this law and introduce their murderer only after several other characters, unquote. Now, this is very interesting. He says that I want the writers of detective fiction to remember this, that the sympathies of the reader lie with the characters that they meet in the first 10 pages. So, automatically, he says, if the writer of detective fiction has to introduce, a murderer, he should not be introduced in the first initial pages. Why? Because there will be a conflict, right? Conflict what? That a reader may develop a sympathy for this character, right? This character, of course, is not revealed as a murderer right at the outset, but eventually will be. But when the reader finds that out, it may cause a kind of a disappointment. So, something very different, something very unique that Maugham suggests here to the authors of detective stories, right? He says that they need to remember this law and introduce their murderer only after several other characters, unquote. Now, next, thereafter he discusses a bit more about the figure of the murderer. Now, you see, if you notice that whenever you study closely any fiction, any story, any detective story, these are some of the important tropes. The murderer, the plot, how is the story constructed, right? So, these are some of the concepts that Maugham here is then unpacking in the essay, okay. So, now let us see next what does he say about the murderer or the figure of the murderer in a detective story. He says, and I quote, "It is evident that if the murderer is from the beginning made odious," odious means abominable, "your suspicions will fall on him and the story will be finished before it has begun," right? Authors sometimes try to evade the quandary by making all or most of the characters odious, so that you have a choice among them. I am not convinced that this is successful. Okay, we'll just pause at that before we move on to the next part of the quote. What is he saying? He's saying that it is evident that if the murderer is from the beginning constructed as a character who is abominable, who is repulsive, then automatically the suspicion of the author or of the reader will fall on that particular character, right? They will understand that, okay, this character that is negative, which is odious, would then be the murderer, right? He says, but in order to, but then this would defeat the purpose, because then the reader would know who the murderer is, and then the entire interest from the story would be gone. But Maugham says that, in order to tackle this, what the authors sometimes do is that they make all the characters odious in the beginning, right? So that the reader has a choice, and the reader is confused that out of all these characters which are odious, which one could be a murderer, right? While all of them seem to be objectionable for that matter. Okay, so here now Maugham says that I am not convinced that this method is successful. Okay, so he says that this method of creating a murderer or creating a character who will emerge as a murderer is not right. And he then explains why. He says, for one thing, it is hard to believe now, as the Victorians did, in unrelieved villainy. Now, this is an important word, an unrelieved villainy. Unrelieved means, where there is no relief from something. So, he says that it is difficult to believe in such a villainy, means that nobody can be an absolute evil. it's not possible. An individual would have some things about him that are redeeming, some things about him which are good. So this idea of quote unquote unrelieved villainy, he says, is something that is very unpragmatic, right? He said that we know that people are a mixture of good and bad. He has got then, he means the writer of detective fiction, he has got then to make his murderer that same mixture of good and bad that we know human beings are. But he has so to load the dice that when his guilt is brought home to him, we are content to see him hanged. One way of loading the dice is to make the crime a very mean and a brutal one, unquote. Now, he is making two another important points here. So, he says that the murderer should be realistic, okay, which means what? A mixture of good and bad, as he says, right? Because nobody is completely good and nobody is completely bad, okay. Then he says that, that's the mixture that the author must aim for in the character of the murderer. And then he says that the story should be constructed in a manner that the guilt of the murderer is brought home to him, that when this guilt is brought home to him, the reader feels satisfied to see him hanged, okay. And when can this satisfaction appear? If the author makes the crime very, very brutal, okay. So, now you see how he has connected the figure of the murderer to the reader's expectations, to the nature of the crime, okay. So, again very, very insightful observations about what makes a good detective story, right. Thereafter, he goes on to talk about three detectives of different kinds. He says detectives are of three kinds. There is the police officer, that is the private eye, also known also, I believe, as a shamus, and the amateur. The amateur has for long been very popular, and the writers of this class of fiction have exerted their invention to devise a character that they could use again and again. The police officer is generally a conventional figure with little individuality. At best, he is astute, painstaking and logical, but for the most part, he is unimaginative. Then, of course, he serves as a convenient foil to the amateur's brilliance. So, in this next point, he is talking about the two kinds of detectives. It can be a figure of the police officer or it can be a figure of the amateur. And he says that the figure of the police officer is unimaginative, right? He is painstakingly logical, very, very astute, does not have much individuality. And on the contrary is a detective, that is the amateur detective. He is the one that Somerset Maugham prefers, okay. And in the next quote, he defines the traits of the amateur detective, and he says, and I quote, "The most important of the traits which the writer takes care to attribute to his amateur detective is humor. And this, not as you might suppose, because by making your reader laugh, you induce in him an emotional instability which will make him react more violently to your thrills, but for a much more important reason." Now, he says that one of the defining features of an amateur detective is humor, right? That is, this detective is witty, okay. And then, he goes on to say that this amateur detective then acts as a foil to the police officer who is also involved in the process of detection. So, very clearly bringing out the contrast between these two kinds of detectives and also highlighting the use of humor over there. Thereafter, he makes a fourth important point about a detective story. He says that it is not good for a detective story to have the interest, for it to have a romantic angle. And he says, and I quote, "But to introduce a pretty little love story in the unraveling of a mystery is an error of taste." That's what he calls it, an error of taste, for which there is no excuse. Marriage bells have no place in a detective story. I think another error that these writers often commit is to make the method of murder too far-fetched. Now here he is talking about the often made mistakes in a detective story, that they introduce romance or marriage. He says that they have no place in it. Second is, he says that the murder becomes too far-fetched. They make it a bit too, in that sense, far-fetched, very, very exaggerated. Both of which he very strongly disagrees with, and he calls them an error of taste. Okay. Then he goes on to say that the best writers of detective stories are those who give you the facts and the inferences to be drawn from them in readable English, but without any graces of style. Fine writing is here out of place. Okay? He says that we do not want a purple passage to distract us when we hanker to know the meaning of that bruise on the butler's chin. So what is he trying to say here? He is trying to highlight yet another important feature of detective fiction, which is what? That it needs to have a simple style. He says the reader does not need to be swept off their feet by fancy language or fancy way of depiction, because the focus is supposed to be elsewhere, right? And then lastly, he highlights some of the important features that he feels that some of the important points that he feels that the writers of detective fiction must keep in mind. And he says, the detective writers have a story to tell and they tell it briefly. They must capture and hold the reader's attention, and so must get into their story with dispatch. They must arouse curiosity, excite suspense, and by the invention of incident, maintain the reader's interest. Right? So very clearly, he's given some important words which define a good, detective short story. That it should be a story that holds the reader's attention, arouse his curiosity, excite his suspense, and by invention of incident, maintain the reader's interest. Right? So these are some of the important points that Somerset Maugham makes in this essay, and thereafter in the essay he discusses some important figures of from different stories, from different detective stories that he has come across. Right? So he talks about the figure of the detective. He talks about the figure of the murderer. He discusses here, what are some of the common mistakes made by the authors of detective stories, what does not work in such narratives, and lastly, what are some of the important features of this style of writing as well. So you see, we notice that this essay then therefore comes across as a brilliant piece of literary criticism, where Somerset Maugham expresses his ideas about the detective short story. I hope that you're going to read other essays by Maugham from this collection. That is the one that we've picked up this one from, that is The Moving Vagrant, and you will acquaint yourselves still more with his work across the different essays. Thank you.